The intolerant and increasingly dangerous left-wing and globalist parties in Germany and their sycophants in the media continue to unmask their true colors. After over a decade of trying to smear, besmirch, alienate, and even ban their political rival party, the Alternative für Deutschland or Alternative for Germany party, because they can't defeat them in public opinion, they are now turning their rage against anyone who even meets the AfD halfway in their goals. The left in Germany are now calling for the outright banning of not just the hated and feared AfD party, but the centrist right party, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. These two parties represent over half the German voting population. And what do you suppose the crime was for the CDU to be included in the AfD for a call to banning both parties? It was the voting and passing of a so-called 5-point immigration plan. The plan was proposed by Friedrich Merz, leader of the Christian Democratic Union. The bill passed with 348 votes in favor of and 345 against, with 10 being absentees. Now, this law aims to create an implementation of permanent border checks, mandatory rejection of all attempts at illegal entry. It was also the detention of individuals ordered to leave the country, increased support for states to enforce deportation orders, and tightening of residency rights for offenders and potential security threats. All fairly reasonable, you could argue. Now, this plan was introduced, by the way, following the latest in a long line of violent incidents in Germany, including a recent knife attack that resulted in 2 deaths. The attacker, surprise, surprise, was identified as an Afghan asylum seeker, gotta love that term, asylum seeker, who had been scheduled for deportation. Boy, does that sound similar to what's happening here in the US. The intolerant, angry left, though, isn't necessarily just angry because of this 5-point immigration plan. Instead, the rage, the apoplectic outrage by the left, stems from the fact that the CDU actually worked with the AfD to pass this bill. They are frothing mad because by working with the AfD, the myth of this so-called extremist far-right party as the new Satan is damaged, and this the left cannot stand. Now, this is an article from Remix News, and it's titled, Germany, after historic immigration law passes, there are now calls to ban the CDU in addition to the AfD. Remix News writes, the political fallout is coming fast and furious. After the Christian Democrats, or CDU, passed a historic new 5-point law tightening immigration by relying on votes from the Alternative for Germany, 1,000 left-wing protesters gathered in front of the CDU headquarters in Berlin, with Bild writing that they are calling for a ban on the CDU and AfD. This call for a ban comes despite both parties, when their polling numbers are combined, constituting close to 50% of the vote in Germany. Now, Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the joint agreement of the Union, FDP, and AfD to tighten asylum laws amounted to breaking of taboos. He also added during an appearance on the Maisberger television program that he can no longer trust Friedrich Merz. However, he struck a more cautious note about a ban of the AfD, saying that the evidence is not yet in place to successfully pursue a ban of the AfD. He said, "We are a constitutional state, and even people who are completely rejected must be able to trust it. Banning a party is, quote, very, very difficult, and the last step, when you get to that point, you have to prepare for very carefully." However, he called for the continuous surveillance of the AfD from German security services. That's right. The German government has been actively spying on the AfD for some time. They have been attempting to undermine and destroy their opposition. They know that they can't wipe out the Alternative für Deutschland at the ballot box. They can't strip the growing public support for this party. It's too late for that. And the left wing knows this. They know that the German population is starting to become awake. They can see the growing danger from within their own country. There's a reason why there's now up to 23% of the German population supporting the AfD, which now makes them the second largest party in the country. And this outrages the ruling class of Germany. They are angry. They are apoplectic that their attempts to try and stamp out the party has been met with no success. You see, back in 2013, concerns that Germany was giving too much of itself away to the European Union. The constant bailing out of other less fortunate countries, taking money from the Germans, the loss of their country's currency, they disliked the euro taking the place of the German mark, and perhaps most importantly, the loss of power from Germany in controlling their own territory and instead giving it to the EU. This led, by the way, to many things like mandatory migration. The EU put migrant quotas on all of their countries, something which Poland has been fighting against for some time now. The European Union also restricted border controls of their countries and even limited how long each country could detain so-called asylum seekers during processing, limiting it to just 12 weeks. Now, these last couple of examples would set the stage for the next evolution of the AfD. You see, back in 2015, the then Chancellor Angela Merkel, who is perhaps the dumbest, least intelligent chancellor in modern German history, made one of the biggest blunders of all time. She decided to have her country house 1.1 million Syrian asylum seekers, famously declaring to the world that we can do it. Now, this decision was the beginning of the end for her and her party's dominance, though she didn't know it at the time. This massive, overwhelming wave of migrants flooding Germany overwhelmed their refugee settlement system. This resulted in chaos and poor living conditions for many of the asylum seekers. But that was only just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. That very same year, in 2015, on New Year's Eve, thousands of these so-called asylum seekers descended across Germany and sexually assaulted and raped over 1,000 women, roughly about 1,200. And the city of Cologne was hit hardest, nearly 500 incidences of sexual assault and rape. And the inept German government's response at the time to all of this was to teach Syrian men on how to not assault German women by teaching them about how to have sex the right way. Now, equally bad to all of this, the CDU, at the time, the party, ignored their constituents' cries to end this mass migration into their country. They broke their promise to their voters that they would do something about this, and that would lead many voters to the AfD, causing its rise to begin. Now, in what mirrored the same media response here in the US to the rise of the so-called MAGA movement, or the Make America Great Again movement, German media outlets began to portray the AfD in a largely negative and dismissive manner. It started off with labeling the leaders of the AfD as right-wing extremists. And once the media realized that this wasn't enough to stop the party from growing, they began to stereotype the supporters of the party. The AfD voters were then laughed at as old, racist, poor, and uneducated, stupid. But this approach failed to stop the party's growth. And so then it was time for the media to start the Nazi comparisons. The press then moved to depict the AfD voters as a more generally right-wing populist Nazis. But all that this did was create a groundswell of growing support for the party and those within, just like here in the United States with the Donald Trump supporters who were rightly outraged at the caricatures the left made of them. And that meant that they dug in, just like they did in Germany. And so the support would harden for the AfD. And most importantly, the media began losing sway with millions of Germans who began to realize that their media had decided that they and their party was evil and objectivity was thrown away. The media was now working with the political establishment to suppress them. Now, this perception of the media was reinforced by the fact that most journalists at top German newspapers shared views aligned with the current political establishment. Voters saw how the government and the media sanitized incidents of immigration violence, like that of the mass sexual assaults back in 2015-2016 New Year's Eve. And so the AfD gained more momentum. And as the AfD began to get electoral success, coverage began to shift once more. Following events like Brexit and Trump's election here in the United States, many journalists started taking the AfD much more seriously as a political force. They began working overtime then to destroy the party. The branding of the AfD as a threat to Germany has now been ongoing for years now, and it is vicious. The political establishment has been using the media to help fuel their attempts to eventually try and ban the party outright. But all this has done has alienated AfD party members from ever even considering leaving their party. They are now on an island, They are called evil and Nazis, and that means that the AfD is not going to lose any support from their base, which leaves only one real possibility, and that is that they will continue to grow. And so the government began to take more direct action. They began surveilling the AfD party. The Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, or the BFV, what a wonderful name, has classified the entire AfD party as a suspected right-wing extremist case since March of 2021. This designation allows for the government to increase monitoring of the party's activities. They can spy on them now. The government officials have also made strong statements against the AfD directly. For example, Chancellor Olaf Scholz expressed gratitude for anti-AfD protesters, warning that any expulsion plan amounted to an attack against our democracy, expulsion meaning of the immigrants causing problems within Germany. There was also Thomas Halden, president of the BFV, who stated that the AfD had become increasingly extremist and anti-democratic, claiming some party candidates express far-right extremist conspiracy theories. However, despite all of this, the AfD party continues to gain momentum. So much so that even the CDU has now bent and worked with the AfD. Which brings us back to present day and back to the German article. They go on to write, other left-wing politicians, particularly from the Greens and the Left Party, have been calling for a ban for some time, while Scholz has been more cautious. However, there have been no official calls for a ban on the CDU from party bigwigs yet. The mood could quickly shift if the CDU steps up its cooperation with the AfD, however. Left-wing political parties are still calling for action against the CDU, with the Green Youth proposing a firewall against the party. And as you might imagine, the AfD has been ecstatic. The Remix News article writes, they are ecstatic about the vote outcome, which signals the end of so-called firewall. This is truly a historic moment, said the chief whip of the AfD parliamentary faction. This means the end of red-green dominance here in Germany forever. A new era is beginning here and now, and we are leading it. And so Germany and the EU seems to be on the brink right now. The years of bringing in millions of migrants from Islamic countries all across the European bloc and the UK has been one of the driving controversial forces in helping to break down the left-wing globalist-minded liberal order that has dominated the bloc for decades. Now, we can also admit that the incompetent response to COVID played a pivotal role here, with their endless lockdowns, mandates, and rules that helped drive the anger from citizens across the board. But regardless, the tipping point seems to be nearing. Now, what happens next in Germany will be fascinating to watch. The breaking point for the status quo is fast approaching. And thanks in large part to social media, which has broken down the control of the government and their propaganda, as long as some semblance of free speech remains, on these platforms that is, we might actually see real reform and change in countries like Germany that are clearly rotting from within. Of course, it could also turn out badly, but I guess we're just going to have to wait and see.